We'd been planning that camping trip through Azusa Canyon for a few weeks. It was meant to be a simple weekend, a chance to get outside, away from our phones, and away from work and noise. My brother, as usual, made sure to take control of everything the second we started packing. He liked to act like he was some expert outdoorsman, even though he'd only been hiking a handful of times in his life. From the moment we parked the car near the trailhead, it was non-stop orders and bossy instructions. He barked out reminders to tighten our laces, to pack our water bottles evenly, to stay close behind him. He wasn't doing it to be helpful, he just liked being in charge. It was hot that morning, the kind of dry heat that bakes off the canyon walls and leaves your mouth feeling like sandpaper. The trail wound through patches of low brush and scattered trees, with sharp, dusty switchbacks that climbed higher toward the ridges. I tried to focus on the sound of my boots crunching on gravel and the hum of insects around me, but my brother's voice cut through every moment of peace. He kept stopping to check the map, to tell us which direction the trail went, or to complain about how slow we were moving. It was supposed to be fun, but after the first hour, I was counting the minutes until I could set up camp and not have to listen to him anymore. Every time I fell a few steps behind, he turned around to wave me forward, calling out like he was leading a group of recruits. My patience thinned with each mile. The canyon was beautiful though, even with him ruining the peace. The steep rock faces had that golden color that only comes from years of sun and wind. You could hear the faint sound of water down in the ravine, and now and then a hawk drifted overhead, gliding without effort. Despite the heat, a small breeze moved through the trees, rattling dry leaves like whispers. After about 3 miles, we stopped for water near a bend where the trail widened. My brother sat down on a rock, still talking, still pointing out which way he thought we'd go next. I tried to zone out. The air smelled like dust and dry pine, and the silence between his words was the only thing that felt peaceful. When we started hiking again, the trail became narrower and more shaded. Tall sycamores leaned over the path, their branches twisted and heavy. The air felt cooler there, almost damp. The light came through in thin patches, flickering across the dirt. The ground was littered with dry leaves and small twigs that snapped softly under our boots. He was still talking, something about how people get lost in canyons like this because they don't pay attention to landmarks. Then, right as he was lecturing about being careful, something cracked above us. It wasn't a light sound like a twig. It was sharp and heavy, like the deep pop of wood splitting under strain. I remember freezing in place. My head tilted up automatically, and that's when I saw it. A thick branch, maybe 30 feet up the tree, long and heavy, starting to tear away from the trunk. For a split second it just hung there, bending under its own weight, and then it gave way completely. Came down fast, breaking smaller limbs on its way. It landed right in front of him, close enough that pieces of bark and dust flew up into his face. He didn't even move at first. The thing must have weighed a few 100 pounds. If it had fallen a few feet closer, it would have crushed him outright. There was a loud thud that echoed through the trees, and for a moment, the whole canyon went silent. Even the insects stopped. He just stood there, staring at it. His shirt had bits of dirt on it, and his face was pale. I could see the mark where the branch had scraped the ground, just inches from his boots. The smell of splintered wood and dust hung in the air. It was weird how quiet everything became after that. Not a single bird sound, no rustling, nothing but our breathing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He stepped back from the branch slowly, looking up at the spot where it had broken off. A dark scar ran along the tree where the wood had split. You could see that it had been dead for a while, probably hollowed out from the inside, just waiting for the right breeze or shift in weight to snap it loose. The funny thing was, after that, he didn't say another word. Not for the rest of the hike. The same guy who had spent hours barking out orders and directions just kept his mouth shut. He stayed a few steps ahead, walking faster than before, glancing up every once in a while at the trees overhead as if they might drop something else. As we moved deeper into the canyon, I could tell he was shaken. His posture had changed. He wasn't puffing out his chest anymore. His steps were shorter, slower, and careful. Every creak or rustle made him flinch a little. For the rest of the 6 miles, there was no lecturing, no correcting, no bossing around. Just silence and the steady rhythm of our boots on the dirt. It was strange how that one moment, that one crack of wood and a close call, could shut someone down completely. It made me realize how fragile all that fake confidence can be. He had spent all morning acting like he was untouchable, like he was in control of everything around him, and in a second, a random piece of dead would nearly ended him. We didn't talk about it when we got back to the car. The sun was starting to drop behind the canyon walls, and the light had that dim orange haze that makes everything feel smaller. I could see him still glancing over his shoulder as we packed up, his eyes flicking toward the tree line like he was waiting for something else to fall. That night, sitting by the small campfire, I caught him looking into the flames with that same blank expression. He barely ate, barely said anything. I think he was still hearing that sound, that loud, splintering crack echoing above him. I didn't feel sorry for him exactly, but I did feel something strange. Maybe it was just the quiet, or the way the canyon seemed to swallow up every noise except the fire popping. I realized how easy it is to forget that nature doesn't care who's leading the hike or who's trying to act tough. Out there, things happen without warning. A shift of wind, a loose rock, a dead branch, and you either respect it or you get reminded the hard way. The next morning, we packed up early. The air was still cool, and the sky was clear. He didn't try to take charge this time. He just followed the trail in silence, his pack sitting low on his shoulders. I stayed a few steps behind him, watching the way he kept his eyes on the trees. When we finally got back to the car, he just sat in the driver's seat for a while before starting the engine. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind that comes after something real happens, when words don't add anything. That branch probably broke because of old rot and weight, or maybe from rain weakening it a few weeks before. But timing is everything, and the timing that day was perfect. Not enough to hurt him, just enough to shut him up and remind him that the canyon doesn't care how loud you talk. He never acted the same on hikes again. After that trip, he was quieter, more patient, more careful. Every time we passed under big trees, I'd catch him looking up for a moment, as if he was making sure they were still holding on. That branch could have killed him, but instead it just took the attitude out of him, and maybe that was exactly what needed to fall that day. I went camping alone one weekend at a small family campground just outside town, a place I'd been to once as a kid. It was quiet, cheap, and never very busy. I just wanted a simple night in nature, build a fire, cook some food, sleep under the stars, and take a break from everything. The campground had maybe 10 sites total, spaced far enough apart that you could still have privacy, but close enough that you might hear the occasional laughter or radio from another group. It was the kind of place where families brought their kids, or older couples parked small campers and sat out in folding chairs with flashlights and books. When I pulled in that Friday afternoon, there were only 3 other campsites occupied. One had a family with 2 little kids running around. Another had a couple who looked to be in their 40s. The last one, farther down a small dirt trail, had a group of cars parked in a way that looked a bit odd. Not close to the camp area, more like they were trying not to be seen from the main path. I didn't think much of it. Some people just liked extra privacy. I set up my tent near a small cluster of pine trees and got a fire going. The day was warm, but the air cooled fast as the sun dropped behind the hills. I grilled a few hot dogs, drank a couple beers, and watched the sky turn deep blue. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Around dusk, I noticed a faint light deeper in the woods, off a side path I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a campfire glow exactly, more like a dull, steady light, flickering just slightly. I figured it was someone else camping farther off. As night came, I could still see the faint glow out there, past the trees. I could hear sounds too, soft, rhythmic noises, maybe music, but muffled. It was strange because it didn't sound like a speaker or a radio, just a low, repeating beat that carried through the still air. By around 10, I was restless. I couldn't help my curiosity. The campground was supposed to close to day visitors by 8, so whoever was out there had to be staying overnight too. But there wasn't a marked site that direction on the map they gave me when I checked in. I thought maybe someone had found a hidden spot or a place they weren't supposed to camp. I decided to walk over and check it out, mostly because I was bored and a little buzzed. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the narrow trail past the last row of campsites. The dirt path curved and narrowed, weaving between thick clusters of trees. The sound grew clearer as I walked. Music for sure now, slow and heavy with deep bass. I could also hear faint murmuring or maybe laughter mixed in, but it was too distant to make out clearly. After about 5 minutes of walking, I began to see a glow ahead, faint but warmer than a flashlight beam. It flickered more like firelight. I turned off my flashlight for a second to adjust my eyes and moved quietly toward it. The woods were silent otherwise, except for the faint hum of insects. When I got closer, I could see the light was coming from several small lanterns set up in a circle. The lanterns were hanging from tree branches and stakes in the ground, giving off a dim orange glow that flickered slightly with the movement of air. There were also candles placed around on stumps and rocks, and what looked like a tarp or mat spread out on the ground in the center of the small clearing. At first, I thought it was just a group of friends hanging out, maybe a late-night gathering. But then I realized there was something strange about the way they moved. I couldn't see clearly at first, just silhouettes shifting in the firelight. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. There were at least 10 people, maybe more, and none of them seemed to be wearing much of anything. They were gathered close, in this strange, slow movement that didn't look like dancing but wasn't just sitting around either. The music was playing from somewhere, soft and deep, but there was no talking, no laughter, just heavy breathing and this low rhythm of motion. I froze where I was. My first thought was pure confusion. I didn't even process what I was looking at right away. My brain tried to make sense of it. It looked like something you'd expect to see in a movie or some kind of ritual scene. Then it hit me what it probably was. Some kind of adult gathering, an orgy, right there in the woods of a family campground. For a moment, I just stood there, watching from behind a tree, trying to decide what to do. I felt embarrassed even though no one could see me. I didn't want to intrude, but at the same time, something about it felt off. The whole thing was too quiet. No joking, no talking, just the same slow movements and soft sounds. Then I noticed something else that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. None of them had any kind of light pointed at their faces, but from the side view I had, I could tell all their heads were tilted slightly downward, not looking at each other, not interacting like people usually do, just moving in this eerie, synchronized way, faces down like they were focused on something below them. I started to back away, slow and quiet, not wanting to make any sound. My foot caught a small branch and snapped it. The sound was sharp in the still air. Instantly, the movement in the clearing stopped. The music cut off. Everything went silent. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it shaking in my chest. I stared through the trees, trying to see if anyone was looking my way. The glow from the lanterns flickered, shadows shifting across their skin, but none of them moved. It was like they all froze at once, perfectly still. After several seconds, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked fast back down the path, keeping my flashlight off until I was far enough away that I couldn't see the light behind me anymore. Then I turned it on and started running. The sound of my own breathing was loud in the dark. Every tree looked the same, Every shadow looked like someone standing just beyond the light. When I finally reached my tent, I didn't even stop to take my boots off. I just got inside, zipped it up, and sat there trying to calm down. I could still feel that strange cold unease in my stomach. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. No music, no footsteps, nothing. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't even make coffee. As I was leaving, I noticed that the group of cars that had been parked oddly the day before were gone. Every one of them. The site looked untouched, like no one had been there at all. Later that week, I looked up the campground online. There were a few forum posts about it. Mostly people saying it was quiet and nice for families, but one comment caught my attention. Someone mentioned hearing strange noises in the woods at night, like chanting or music, and seeing cars coming in late after the ranger station was closed. A reply underneath said it was probably a private adult meetup group that used to go there sometimes. No one really complained because they kept to themselves. That explanation made sense, I guess. I want to believe that's all it was, a group of adults doing something weird and private in the woods. But the part that still bothers me years later is how quiet they were. How completely still they became when they heard me. I've camped plenty of times since then, and I've heard all kinds of strange things in the woods. Animals, voices, even music in the distance. But I've never again heard that kind of silence that follows when something unnatural stops moving all at once. Maybe it really was just an orgy, some secret event I wasn't supposed to see. But sometimes I think about how every head was tilted down, every body moving in unison without a sound. And I still can't shake the thought that I didn't just stumble onto something private. I might have walked into something I was never supposed to find at all. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when I opened the door to my apartment that day in Sydney. It was supposed to be a simple return home after a 10-day rental. Nothing unusual, just another guest who had booked through Airbnb like so many before. I had rented out my place dozens of times without any issue. My apartment sat on the third floor of a quiet building near Surrey Hills, a cozy one-bedroom space I had poured years of work and money into. I'd furnished it carefully, kept everything spotless, made sure guests always had clean towels, quality linens, and all the comforts that made it feel like a home rather than just a rental. When the booking came through, the profile looked normal. It was a man with a verified account, polite in his messages, saying he needed a place for 10 days while on business. His profile showed previous good reviews, nothing suspicious. I accepted without hesitation. He paid in full, checked in smoothly, and sent a quick note thanking me. For those 10 days, I didn't think much about it. Everything seemed routine. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when I went back to the apartment. I remember the air felt heavy that day, gray clouds hanging low over the city. I carried my small suitcase up the stairs, thinking about how good it would feel to get home and rest in my own bed again. But as soon as I reached my door, something felt off. The handle had a faint sticky residue on it, like it had been touched by oily hands. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the smell. It hit me the moment I pushed the door open. Thick, chemical, and sour, mixed with something metallic that made my throat tighten. It was the kind of smell that doesn't belong in a home, something sharp and dirty that clings to everything. The air inside felt wrong. I stepped in slowly, my hands still on the doorframe, and what I saw didn't even register at first. The living room was completely destroyed. My rug, the expensive wool one I had bought from a small shop in Paddington, was soaked and stained dark in patches, the edges torn. The coffee table was tipped on its side. One leg snapped clean off. The couch cushions were slashed open, their stuffing pulled out and scattered across the floor like snow. Bottles, cans, ashtrays, and plastic bags were everywhere. I took a few steps forward, numb, looking around at the chaos. Every surface was covered with something, burnt foil, syringes, little plastic tubes, scorched spoons, empty packets. There were cigarette burns on the arm of the couch, the kind that leave deep black circles. The walls were smudged with fingerprints and streaks of something that looked like soot. My framed photos were smashed. My bookshelf was half empty. The books I'd collected over the years tossed around or missing. I walked further in, and the smell grew worse, sharper, heavier. In the kitchen, the counter was covered in dirty dishes, most of them not mine. Someone had cooked something that had burned and been left to rot. The sink was full of black water. The floor was sticky, and when I stepped on it, it made a faint pulling sound. My hands were shaking. Then I went toward the bedroom, and that's when I saw it. The bed was stripped bare, the sheets gone. My towels, the white ones I'd folded neatly in the closet before leaving, were on the floor, soaked in dark stains that I knew instantly were blood. Not just small spots, large smears and soaked patches that had dried into the fabric. The sight made me freeze completely. I couldn't tell what had happened, but the image burned itself into my mind. It didn't look like a simple injury or accident. It looked violent. The dresser drawers were all pulled out and emptied. My jewelry box was open, nearly everything gone. The small safe I kept under the bed had been pried open. Inside, where I usually kept spare cash and a few documents, there was nothing but broken hinges. My laptop was gone. The TV had been ripped off the wall, cables dangling like torn veins. My camera, my watch, even some clothes were missing. It was like someone had lived a completely different life in that apartment for those 10 days. A chaotic, destructive existence that left nothing untouched. I remember standing in the middle of the room, trying to piece it all together, but my mind couldn't keep up. The silence inside the apartment felt heavy and wrong. Every creak and sound from outside made me flinch. I could still smell the chemical odor mixed with the sharpness of blood and burnt material. When I stepped into the bathroom, the damage only got worse. The mirror was cracked. The tiles were smeared with something dark and greasy. The towels were piled in the corner, stained and stiff. My toiletries were scattered across the sink, some broken open. The shower curtain had been ripped halfway down, and there were cigarette burns along the edge of the sink. The whole place looked less like someone had rented it and more like it had been taken over by something uncontrolled, something desperate. I could almost picture the nights that must have happened there. The loud music, the shouting, the crashing, the smell of drugs burning. Maybe people coming and going at all hours, strangers who had no idea whose home it was. It wasn't hard to imagine the chaos that must have taken place in those 10 days. I called the police and they came within an hour. They walked through the apartment quietly, taking pictures, making notes. They told me they'd seen this kind of thing before, Airbnb rentals used for drug binges or parties that spiral out of control. They said it could have been a group using a fake profile, or someone who rented it legitimately and then invited others in. Either way, they were gone now. The investigation didn't turn up much. The guest's account had been deleted. The contact number he'd used was disconnected. The name on the ID he uploaded didn't match any real person. Airbnb cooperated with the police, but there wasn't much they could do. It was a fake identity tied to stolen information. Whoever did it had planned it that way. I spent the next few weeks cleaning, replacing, and repairing everything. The rugs were ruined beyond saving. The couch had to be thrown out. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, replaced the locks. Even after everything was spotless again, the smell lingered for weeks. Faint but always there, a mix of smoke and rot that clung to the air. I could never get it completely out. Every time I thought it was gone, it would drift back on humid days, reminding me. The cost of the damage came to over $10,000. Airbnb covered some of it through their host guarantee, but it didn't feel like enough. The money didn't erase what had happened. It didn't take away that memory of standing in my own home, surrounded by filth and destruction, realizing that strangers had done things there I could never fully imagine. I stopped renting it out after that. Couldn't. The thought of handing over my keys to another stranger made my skin crawl. The apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. Even after I replaced everything, it still felt tainted, like the walls themselves had absorbed something rotten. It took me almost a year to feel comfortable living there again. For a long time, I'd wake up at night thinking I heard footsteps or voices, even though I knew it was just my mind replaying the chaos I never actually saw. I never found out who did it or what really happened during those 10 days. The police eventually closed the case, labeling it as property vandalism and theft, nothing more. But every time I think about it, I picture that first moment. The smell, the sticky floor, the blood-soaked towels. It wasn't just about the money or the repairs. It was the realization that for 10 days, my home had been something else entirely, a place of violence, addiction, and destruction. I had rented it out thinking it would be used for rest, for comfort, for normal life. Instead, it became a space for something dark, something that left its mark on every inch of it. Now, whenever I see a listing online or pass a building filled with short-term rentals, I think about how easily trust can be broken. How easy it is to hand your life, your space, and your sense of safety over to someone you don't really know. I still live in that apartment today, but there are moments when I catch a faint trace of that old smell in the air, and for a second, it feels like it's all still there, hidden under the surface, waiting. I remember that day clear as anything. It was late summer, sometime around early evening, when the air starts to cool and everything gets that dull golden light. I had taken my bike out to ride along the old towpath that runs between the river and the old canal. It's one of those quiet trails where you don't see many people, just long stretches of dirt, trees pressing in on both sides, and the steady rush of water somewhere off to your right. The ground was mostly dry, packed from all the foot and bike traffic, but there were still a few spots that stayed soft after the rains we'd had the week before. It had been a wet few weeks. Heavy rain that lasted for days, the kind that floods the low areas and sends the creeks spilling over into the ditches. The air still smelled damp even though it hadn't rained in days. You could feel the humidity rising off the river, and every once in a while, I'd ride through a pocket of cool air that carried the faint scent of algae and wet wood. I was alone for miles, and I liked that. It's the kind of solitude that's peaceful at first, until you realize how far you are from anyone else. I'd been riding for maybe an hour when it happened. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long across the path. I came around a slow bend, coasting with my hands resting lightly on the bars, just taking in the sound of the river. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a dark shape hanging over the water, maybe a piece of debris or a fallen tree that had gotten caught. But the closer I got, the more it came into focus, and everything in me just went still. It was a horse, a dead horse, hanging halfway over the riverbank, its body twisted unnaturally, and its head wedged into the crook of a tree that leaned out over the water. I stopped the bike so fast that the tires slid in the dirt. For a long second, I just stood there straddling the frame, staring. It didn't even make sense at first. You don't expect to see something like that out there. No farms nearby, no pastures, nothing that would explain it. The animal's body looked bloated and stiff, the skin stretched tight and dark from the sun. The smell hit me next, that heavy, sweet stench of decay that you can almost taste in the back of your throat. I could see flies swarming around the body, clinging to its sides and face. The sound of them was faint but constant, a low buzzing that mixed with the rush of the river below. For a moment, I honestly thought about just turning around and getting out of there. It felt wrong to stand there staring at it. The whole scene was so quiet and still that it made my skin crawl. But then curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't understand how it had ended up like that. The river wasn't deep enough right there to carry something that large, and there was no easy way down the bank to check. I stood there, shifting from one foot to the other, trying to piece it together. The horse's head was caught perfectly in the V of a thick tree branch that stuck out over the water. Its neck hung down, the rest of its body half on land, half over the river. The legs were stiff and angled awkwardly, like it had been caught mid-struggle. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that it hadn't been placed there. It had ended up that way by accident. But how? After about 10 minutes of staring and walking in slow circles trying to get a better view through the brush, I started to make sense of it. The ground near the river's edge was marked by lines and debris that didn't match the rest of the forest floor. Bits of twigs, silt, and trash caught in the branches higher up than they should have been. The water line had clearly been much higher recently. That's when it clicked. The floods. We'd had days of non-stop rain earlier that month, and a lot of the low-lying areas around the river had gone under. I remembered seeing pictures online. Barns surrounded by water, fences half submerged, even a few stories about livestock getting swept away. The horse must have been caught in that. Maybe it drowned or got pulled into the current. The Deschutes and the canal both connect in weird ways, and the water runs fast when it's high. If the current carried it downstream, it could have easily ended up lodged where it was. When the water level dropped again, the body was left hanging there, trapped by the tree. It made perfect sense, but even knowing that didn't make it any less disturbing. The image of that horse stuck there, head twisted in the crook of the tree, was something I couldn't look away from. It didn't look peaceful or still. It looked like something caught in the middle of panic that never ended. The air felt thicker the longer I stood there. The sun was nearly gone now, just faint light filtering through the leaves. The river reflected it in shimmers, and for a moment it almost looked like the water was moving around the body even though it wasn't. The smell was stronger too. I covered my nose with my arm and backed away. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no rustling. Just that steady hum of insects and the faint sound of the current below. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every sound you make. My breathing sounded too loud. My boots on the dirt sounded heavy. I suddenly realized how far I was from anything. No houses, no parked cars, no one walking their dog. Nothing. Just me and that dead horse suspended above the river. I turned my bike around and started pedaling back the way I came. For the first half mile, I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder, even though I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe I was just unnerved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that whole area was off. Not supernatural, just wrong in the way abandoned places or forgotten things sometimes are. Like no one had been there for a long time, and maybe no one should be. By the time I reached the parking area near the old bridge, it was nearly dark. The sky had turned that deep blue that fades fast, and the air felt colder. I loaded my bike into the back of my truck and sat for a while before starting the engine. My mind kept replaying the scene. The way the horse hung there, the sound of the flies, the stillness of the water below it. Later that night, I looked up flood reports from the area. Sure enough, a few farms upstream had reported losing animals in the high water. It wasn't some strange mystery after all, just a sad, natural result of the storm and the river doing what rivers do. But the image stayed with me. It wasn't horror in the usual sense. It wasn't about being scared of something chasing me or hiding in the dark. It was the quiet horror of seeing what nature can do, how something alive and powerful can end up caught and motionless, left hanging in an impossible position just because of bad timing and water levels. I went back a few weeks later, when curiosity got the best of me again. The river had dropped even more. The body was gone. All that was left was a dark stain on the bark where the head had been wedged and a few tufts of hair tangled in the branches. The smell was gone, too, replaced by the usual earthy dampness of the woods. It almost looked like nothing had ever happened there. I stood for a while looking out over the water, the surface calm and clear, small fish darting in the shallow pools near the edge. You'd never guess that something that big, that heavy, had once hung there. It reminded me how temporary everything in nature is, how quickly it takes things and erases them again. After that day, I never rode that stretch of the towpath alone again. It's still one of my favorite trails, but whenever I pass that bend, I always slow down, glance toward the tree, and remember the sight of that horse caught above the river, frozen in that silent, heavy moment between life and decay. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost story. It was just real, and that made it far worse. I was around 16 when I went on that trip along the Deschutes River with a few friends from high school. It was late spring, warm enough during the day to be comfortable, but cold enough at night that you wanted to crawl deep into your sleeping bag. We had planned the backpacking trip for weeks, mostly to get away from everything. We were all restless and bored, stuck between school and summer, and camping felt like the right kind of escape. None of us were experts at it, but we had enough gear, and the trail wasn't too difficult. It followed the river most of the way, twisting through dry canyons and patches of tall grass that rustled in the wind. I remember that morning being quiet. We had left camp early and walked for hours, the sound of the river always nearby. The trail cut through stretches of open land before dipping into shaded parts where cottonwoods leaned over the water. The air smelled like dust and sagebrush. My backpack rubbed against my shoulders, and I kept shifting it to find a more comfortable position. My boots were already dirty, the laces crusted with dried mud from a crossing the day before. By noon, we were all tired. The sun was right above us, and the air felt dry and heavy. We decided to stop and eat before continuing. That's when we spotted the boxcar. It was sitting maybe 50 yards off the trail, surrounded by weeds and brush, the metal sides faded and streaked with rust. It looked completely out of place, like someone had dropped it there years ago and just left it to rot. The paint on it was almost gone, and what was left peeled off in thin curls. One of the doors was half open, the inside shadowed and dark. We left our packs by the edge of the trail and walked toward it. The ground around it was uneven, covered with broken glass, bits of old metal, and small animal bones that crunched under our boots. The air inside the boxcar was cooler, heavy with the smell of rust and damp wood. Dust floated in the light coming through a hole in the roof. I remember running my hand along one of the walls. It felt rough and cold. The place was silent except for the faint hum of the wind outside. We decided to eat our lunch inside. It was mostly sandwiches and trail mix, simple stuff. Felt like a good spot to rest, at least for a while. The metal floor was covered with dirt and pine needles, but we didn't care. We sat near the open door where the sunlight fell across the floor. Someone mentioned the movie Life of Pi, which had just come out around that time. We'd watched it a few weeks earlier in school for some project. The conversation drifted from the movie to the book and back again. I wasn't really paying attention. I was just staring out at the trees, watching how the wind moved through them. That's when my friend stood up to stretch and reached up toward the low ceiling of the boxcar. There was a small panel of wood wedged between two rusted beams, just barely visible. He tugged on it and it came loose. When it fell, a book slid out and hit the floor with a dull thud. It was Life of Pi. For a moment, none of us said anything. It just sat there, dusty and worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. Someone laughed nervously, and I remember the sound echoing weirdly inside the boxcar. My friend picked it up and brushed it off. Inside the front cover, there was a folded piece of paper. It looked old and had been tucked in carefully, like someone had wanted to keep it hidden but also make sure it could be found. The paper had writing on it, just a few lines, faded and barely legible. It had coordinates and a date, written in blue ink that had almost bled through. At first, I thought it might have been a note someone forgot, but the coordinates made it clear that it was deliberate. It was a geocache. Back then, I didn't know much about geocaching. The idea of people hiding things in random places for strangers to find was strange to me, but it also felt a little eerie. The fact that this book, the same one we were talking about moments before, had been sitting above us all this time made the moment feel strange, like we'd accidentally stepped into someone else's memory. After lunch, we packed up and decided to keep moving. But as we left, I kept thinking about that book. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been there before us, maybe years ago, sitting in that same boxcar, hiding that same book. The note inside was so old that the edges of the paper flaked when you touched it. It made me wonder who had left it and why they had chosen that spot, a rusted-out boxcar in the middle of nowhere. We camped a few miles down the trail that night, near the river. The wind picked up after dark, and the trees made long, shifting shadows across the ground. The sound of the river covered most of the noise, but every so often, I thought I could hear something moving in the brush nearby. I told myself it was just animals, probably deer, but I still had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the coordinates on that paper. I'd written them down in my notebook earlier, curious where they led. That night, when I couldn't sleep, I pulled it out and stared at the numbers under the dim light of my flashlight. They didn't mean much to me then, but the idea that there was another hidden spot somewhere out there, another cache, another item waiting, made me feel uneasy. I wondered if whoever left it was still out there, still walking these trails, still hiding things for people like us to find. The next morning, we packed up early and started hiking again. The sun was still low, and the ground was cold and damp with dew. The trail was quiet except for the sound of our boots. Every time I saw something unusual, an old piece of metal, a half-buried post, a tree with markings, I thought about that boxcar and what might have been hidden there before us. When we got home a few days later, I looked up the coordinates. They led to another spot along the river, a few miles further than we had gone. It was near an old bridge that had been abandoned decades ago. The map showed nothing else there, no campsites, no trails, nothing. Just a patch of empty land. I thought about going back. Part of me wanted to see what was there, but another part of me didn't. Something about it felt wrong. Like the more you looked into it, the more it would pull you in. I don't know why, but the whole thing left a strange feeling that stayed with me for a long time. A few years later, I heard that the boxcar had been removed. Some hikers reported it had collapsed after a storm, and park maintenance had cleared what was left. I never went back to check. I still have the notebook with those coordinates written inside. Sometimes I look at it and wonder who left that geocache, and if they ever came back for it. It's strange how something so small, so random, can stick in your mind for years. We only stopped there for maybe half an hour, just long enough to eat and rest. But that boxcar, the smell, the rust, the silence inside, is something I'll never forget. Maybe it wasn't meant to be anything mysterious. Maybe it really was just a geocache someone left behind years before we found it. But I can't help thinking about the timing. How we were sitting there talking about that exact book, only to find it hidden above us moments later. It felt too strange to be just coincidence. It didn't scare me in the way horror stories do, but it left a kind of quiet unease that I've never shaken. Sometimes when I go hiking now, I keep an eye out for things people might have left behind. A hidden box under a rock, a note in a tree, something that connects strangers across years without them ever meeting. But I've never found anything like that again. Just that one time in an old rusted boxcar by the Deschutes River, where we sat eating our lunch, talking about a book that somehow had already been waiting for us all along. We had been planning that trip to the Great Smoky Mountains for months. I'd been wanting to get away from work, noise, and the endless scrolling of screens. I just wanted trees, clean air, and quiet. When we pulled into the campground, the place looked perfect. The sites were spaced far apart, and the forest wrapped around everything like a wall of green. You could hear the low hum of insects and the soft sound of the creek that ran nearby. The ground was damp from rain earlier in the week, but the air was clean and cool. The campsite itself wasn't anything fancy, just a small clearing with a fire pit, a picnic table, and enough room to set up 2 tents. The smell of pine and wet dirt hung in the air. We unpacked slowly, taking our time to settle in, hammering the stakes into the ground while the light faded behind the trees. The forest in that area had a certain heaviness to it. Even during the day, it felt quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful exactly, more like the kind of silence that presses on your ears. The first night was calm. We built a small fire, cooked some food, and just sat there watching the flames twist and shift. The air got colder as the night went on, and the forest came alive with small sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I didn't think much of it. It's normal for the woods to move like that. Every little sound has a reason. Raccoons, owls, the wind brushing against branches. It wasn't until the next morning that things felt off. When I woke up, there was a thin fog rolling through the trees. The sky was still gray, and the air had that chill that comes right before sunrise. The fire had burned down to cold ash. I walked down to the creek to wash my face and heard the low murmur of voices from another site not far from ours. I didn't pay attention to what they were saying at first, just noise drifting through the damp air. But then I caught a few words that made me stop. They mentioned that someone had died there a few days before we came. A man, they said. Apparently, he had been camping in the exact same site we were using. I didn't hear the whole story, just enough to piece together that it happened suddenly, a heart attack or something close to it. He'd been found in the morning, lying near the fire pit. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the patch of ground by the creek where the dirt met the water. My stomach twisted a little. I walked back toward our site and suddenly everything looked different. The same clearing, same trees, same picnic table, but now it felt heavier. The knowledge that someone's life had ended right there, on that same ground where our tent now sat, changed everything. The fire pit, which had looked old and weathered, now seemed oddly new in spots, like someone had cleaned it recently. The dirt around it had a smooth patch that looked slightly darker than the rest, maybe from rain, maybe not. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of someone spending their last moments right there, alone, in the same quiet woods we were enjoying, sat heavy in my chest. We tried to shake it off. We went for a hike that day, following a narrow trail that wound through the forest, cutting across small streams and weaving around moss-covered rocks. The woods were thick, the canopy high and tangled. Sunlight broke through in thin strips, lighting up the mist that lingered in shaded areas. It should have felt peaceful, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Every time I stopped to take a drink or catch my breath, I kept thinking about that man, how maybe he had walked the same trails, looked at the same view, sat beside the same creek. By late afternoon, we made it back to camp. The air was cooler, and the forest had gone quiet again. Even the birds seemed to stop. We started gathering wood for the fire, but something about being in that clearing felt wrong now. The smell of the damp dirt, the empty stillness, even the way the light filtered through the branches above. It all felt off. When night came, I couldn't relax. The sound of the creek wasn't calming anymore. It felt like background noise that was trying to drown something out. Every flicker of the firelight made the shadows stretch across the trees in strange ways. I kept glancing at the fire pit, the same spot where that man had collapsed, imagining the scene. A sudden pain in the chest, maybe a hand reaching out, the fire crackling just like ours was now. At some point, the fire burned low, and the woods seemed to close in around us. The darkness there was thicker than what you'd see near any city. You could barely see past the trees at the edge of camp. It wasn't fear that kept me awake, not exactly. It was more like an awareness of how fragile everything was, how quickly life can stop. Lying there in the tent, I could hear the faint movement of branches brushing together in the wind, the soft drip of water from leaves. My mind wouldn't quiet down. I kept picturing him, whoever he was, sitting there alone, maybe watching his fire, maybe not feeling well, thinking it was just a cramp or the cold until everything went wrong. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something small. The shift of fabric in the tent, a light crunch outside, the breeze sliding through the trees, and I'd be wide awake again. The forest has a way of amplifying every sound at night. It doesn't take much to make your imagination fill in the blanks. When morning finally came, I stepped outside before anyone else was awake. The air was damp again, the grass wet with dew. The fire pit looked cold and gray, the ashes undisturbed. The forest looked completely calm, like nothing had ever happened there. If I hadn't overheard that story, I would have never known. That realization hit me harder than I expected. How many places we walk through without knowing what's happened there? How many quiet woods, calm lakes, or empty trails have held moments like that? Someone's last breath, someone's fear, someone's silence. Nature doesn't hold onto those things the way people do. It just moves on. The forest goes back to being what it's always been. We packed up later that morning, folding the tent and loading everything back into the truck. As we were getting ready to leave, I took one last look around the clearing. There was nothing there to mark what had happened. No sign, no memorial, nothing at all. Just the same dirt, the same trees, the same faint smell of pine in the air. But I still felt it. Maybe not fear, but a deep sense of respect. That campsite had been someone's final place, and for a brief moment, it had been ours too. On the drive out, the road curved through the forest, sunlight breaking through in flashes. I thought about how quickly things change, how one moment you're alive, breathing the clean mountain air, and the next you're gone, leaving nothing behind but a few quiet memories that someone might stumble across later. It made me look at camping differently after that. I still love the woods, the stillness, the solitude, but I never forget that every patch of ground has its history. Every clearing, every fallen log, every fire pit might have been the backdrop to someone else's story, one that ended quietly under the same stars you're sleeping beneath. When we reached the park entrance, I looked back one last time. The trees swallowed the view of the campsite completely. From the road, you'd never know that anything had ever happened there. And maybe that's just how the forest works. It takes everything in, good or bad, and keeps going like nothing ever changed. The man's death might have been sudden, maybe peaceful, maybe not. I'll never know. But standing there in that same space, knowing what had happened, made me realize how thin that line is between being here and not. That thought stayed with me long after the trip was over. Not in a haunting way, but in a quiet one. Every time I'm out camping now, watching the fire burn down to ash, I think about that man in the Great Smoky Mountains and how, for a few nights, I slept on the same ground where his story ended. It was the summer of 2002 when I went backpacking deep into the forest with a friend. We were both in our early 20s and had just started getting into longer hikes, the kind where you go miles off any main trail and camp somewhere nobody else ever goes. That trip was supposed to be simple. 2 nights out in the woods, far away from roads, people, or lights. We picked a route that followed an old logging trail for a few miles, then cut off into a dense stretch of forest that eventually opened into a large meadow. We started early that morning, hiked most of the day, and by evening we found that meadow. It was beautiful, wide, quiet, and surrounded on all sides by tall trees. The grass was high and dry, and there was a soft hill on one side that looked perfect for setting up camp. The air had that cool smell of pine and dirt, and the only sounds were distant insects and the faint rush of a creek somewhere in the distance. We pitched our tents near the edge of the meadow, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside as the last light faded. The night sky there was incredible. No city lights, no haze, just a clear stretch of stars that went on forever. I don't think I'd ever seen the Milky Way that bright before. You could almost see the texture of it, like a river of dust cutting across the black. It was well past midnight when we decided to just lie back in the grass near our tents and stare at the sky. The air was still, and it was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. There wasn't even a breeze. We were both tired from hiking all day but not sleepy yet. It was that kind of calm that makes you forget time is even moving. That's when we noticed the first one. It looked like a satellite at first, just a small bright point of light moving steadily across the sky. It was too high to be a plane and didn't blink like one. I remember following it with my eyes for a while, tracing its slow path across the stars. Then another one came into view from the opposite direction, moving just as fast and just as steady. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, two satellites crossing paths. That happens sometimes. But the thing was, they weren't just crossing. They were heading directly toward each other. I kept watching, expecting one to fade away before they met, like how satellites sometimes dip out of sunlight and vanish. But neither one dimmed. They just kept getting closer and closer until they reached the same exact point in the sky. And then, for a split second, there was a small flash. It wasn't bright like an explosion, just a quick, clean burst of light, like a spark. One of the lights stopped moving completely. The other one kept going, straight across the sky, at the same speed as before, until it disappeared over the horizon. But that first one just stayed there, completely still. It didn't fade out. It didn't move. It just stayed fixed in the same exact spot. I remember staring at it for what felt like minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't like a shooting star or anything I'd ever seen before. It was steady, unmoving, almost like it had anchored itself in that spot. After a while, I blinked and realized how quiet the woods were. Even the insects had stopped. The silence was deep, heavy, the kind that feels wrong somehow. The air had gotten colder too. Not freezing, but enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I looked around the meadow, half expecting to see something in the dark. The trees at the edge looked darker than before, like shadows were thicker between them. I don't know why, but that still point of light up there suddenly made me feel small, like something was looking back. After a while, the light just faded. Not quickly, slowly, as if it were dimming on purpose. It went from bright to dull, then vanished completely. We didn't say anything for a long time. I just lay there, staring at where it had been, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just a trick of light, maybe space junk colliding or a reflection of something. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. There was something too deliberate about the way it happened. Couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the tall grass near the meadow. A soft, shifting sound, like someone walking slowly. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. But the beam didn't reach far enough to show anything except the closest blades of grass swaying. The sound stopped after a while, but the stillness that followed was worse. When morning came, the air was damp and cold. The meadow looked normal again, sunlight cutting through the mist. It was hard to believe anything strange had happened at all. But I remember scanning the sky again, trying to find the same patch where we'd seen the lights. It was just empty blue. We packed up that afternoon and hiked back toward the main trail. The whole walk felt different from the hike in. Every noise in the woods made me look twice. The trees felt taller, the path narrower. I couldn't shake that image of the two lights colliding, and the one that just stayed there afterward. When we got back to town, I tried to look it up. Maybe there had been a satellite collision or some kind of atmospheric event. I checked news sites and astronomy forums for weeks. Nothing. Not a single mention of anything unusual that night. No recorded re-entries, no meteor reports, no satellite crashes. Over the years, I've told a few people about it, usually as a weird camping story, but every time I do, I realize how hard it is to explain. It's not what we saw that bothers me. It's what didn't make sense afterward. That one light staying perfectly still after impact, then slowly fading. That's not something a satellite or a meteor would do. And then there's that feeling that hit me afterward, that cold, quiet sense that we weren't alone out there. I've camped hundreds of times since then, in all kinds of places, and I've never felt that exact kind of silence again, the kind where the whole forest just stops breathing. I've tried to rationalize it so many times. Maybe it was just a trick of perspective. Maybe one of the lights wasn't moving at all, and it only looked like they collided. Maybe it was just two unrelated things in the sky happening to line up. But no matter how I turn it over in my head, I can still see it clearly. Two bright lights moving fast toward each other, the flash when they met, and then one staying still, watching almost as the other disappeared into the night. It's been over 20 years now, but I still remember that meadow, the smell of pine and cold dirt, the wet grass against my back, and the sound of nothing after it happened. Every time I go camping now, I find myself looking up at the stars a little differently. I still love the quiet, but sometimes, when the night is perfectly still and the sky is too clear, I can't help but think about that one light staying behind, hovering above us long after the other one was gone. And I always wonder what it was doing there, why it stayed still, and why it left so slowly, like it wanted to make sure we were watching.